Hello, and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study podcast, where we explore and explain one chapter of the Bible at a time. My name is Luke, and I'm your host. Today's chapter is Genesis 16. So let's go ahead and read the text together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible. And while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. I will say before we begin today, sorry about my voice. I remain infirmed, and I've got a bad cough, which luckily you won't have to listen to because of the magic of editing. But if my voice sounds a little bit funny and maybe not the most pleasant, that's why. Sorry. Hopefully in a day or two it'll be somewhat back to normal. Genesis 16 conveniently has 16 verses. That's easy to remember. Let's go ahead and read the chapter. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Bir-lahai-roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So that is the text of Genesis chapter 16. We have yet another key event in the life of Abram. Abram finally has a son, but not exactly the way that it was supposed to play out. We're going to talk about the mistakes that were made. There were many in this particular chapter. But for context's sake, let's remind ourselves where we are. We were introduced to Abram in chapter 11 and 12. We talked about how God's going to be following him and his descendants really throughout the entire Old Testament, telling the story of how God is going to save the world and bringing a Savior into the world through Abram's family. In chapter 14, we talked about the war of the 9 kings, the 4 kings against the 5 kings. Lot, Abram's nephew, is captured and kidnapped, and he's taken to the north, and Abram has to save him with his 318 men from his household. We also were introduced to Melchizedek. And then in chapter 15, the contents of that chapter really relate to this one. God, in a way, signs an ancient contract with Abram, promising him a couple things. Number one, that he was going to be made into a great nation, and that he was going to have a biological son, even though him and his wife were getting up there in years. And then number two, that God was going to give his descendants the land of Canaan to live in. You remember how that ancient tradition or ancient practice of making the oath played out. God asked Abram to bring several animals and then to cut them in half and lay them on the ground, and then God passed through them. Evidently, this was a tradition for how ancient people made oaths. And so God gives his word to Abram that he's going to have a biological son and that they're eventually going to receive the land of Canaan. We also got some more details that there was going to be a period of struggle, a period of difficulty between the promise made to Abraham and his descendants finally getting the land of Canaan. You remember it talked about 400 years in a foreign land that Abram's descendants were going to have to go through. And we talked about how that was a prophecy about the Egyptian slavery of the Israelites. But more on that in the book of Exodus. We're not quite there yet. So God has confirmed these promises, and that brings us into chapter 16. And immediately in chapter 16, what we see is doubt that these promises are really going to be fulfilled. If you haven't downloaded our PDF for Genesis chapter 16 that has all the key details on it, I'd encourage you to do that whenever you have the opportunity. We are going to look at a map today that's going to show us the general location of where these events play out, where Hagar goes, where she flees to after fleeing from Sarai, so that will be useful to you, and it no doubt will also help you keep some of these dates straight. So let's go ahead and talk about our first couple categories that we always do: when, who, and where. So when did these events take place? Abram lived 175 years, about 2,000 years before Jesus. The events that are recorded in Genesis 16, we're told specifically, happened when Abram was between 85 and 86 years old. Let's make sure we know who our main characters are. We have Abram, first of all. Later, his name is going to be changed to Abraham. You might know him that way. He was a man from Ur of the Chaldeans. He moved to Canaan at God's instruction, and God made him these promises that he was going to turn into a great nation, and that God was going to give him the land of Canaan, and that all the nations of the earth were going to be blessed through his descendants. We also have Sarai, who is Abram's wife, and one thing that we find out in this chapter, but we've also been told before, is that she's barren. She can't conceive any children, and that's kind of the tension in this chapter. And then we have a new character, and that is Hagar. This is Sarai's Egyptian servant who was given to Abram as an additional wife to bear a son in his name. Now, where does Sarai get an Egyptian servant girl from? Well, probably from their time down in Egypt. Do you remember, this wasn't the highlight of Abram and Sarai's life, but they go down to Egypt, and Abram is concerned that Sarai, being so beautiful, is going to be taken by the Egyptians, and he's going to be killed. And so they lie to the Pharaoh, saying that Sarai is just his sister and there's no other relation. And so then the Pharaoh takes Sarai because she is indeed beautiful. But then God sends plagues on Pharaoh's house because he took another man's wife. Unknowingly, yes, but he had another man's wife and he needed to give her back. So Pharaoh ends up giving her back, and then he sends Abram out of Egypt, but not before giving him animals, male servants, and female servants, the text tells us. So it very well could be that Hagar was part of that gift that was given to Abram. She was one of these female servants who left Egypt with him and returned to Canaan. So now we go to our map, and we want to talk about where these events took place. The key location of Genesis 16 is a spring of water where the angel of the Lord appears to Hagar. It's known as Bir Lahairoi. Now, the exact location is unknown, but most historians believe Bir Lahairoi was located in kind of the wilderness area to the south of the Negev. So we're kind of talking the general area between Canaan and Egypt. Now that we've covered our first three sections, let's go ahead and get into our outline and understand what we just read and how it fits into Abram's larger story. So I've got this chapter broken down into two sections. The first one is verses 1 through 6, Abram, Sarai, and Hagar. As we already talked about, Sarai has this Egyptian servant who's named Hagar. And Sarai one day gets this really bright idea that since she's barren and can't have children and can't fulfill God's promises personally, what she's going to do is basically use Hagar representatively. So she tells Abram, she says, take my servant Hagar, have relations with her, and try to conceive a child with her. Now, anyone who thinks about this situation critically, I think would come to the conclusion very quickly that this is not going to turn out very well. And that's exactly what we see, not only in this chapter, but also in upcoming chapters. There are a number of mistakes that we see here. The first one is that Sarai doesn't trust the Lord, and actually Abram also doesn't trust the Lord to bring about his promise. Now, it would have been hard to trust that. It'd been years since God had given his initial promises, about 10 years. It's a decade at that point. That's a long time. Sarai just continues to get older, and she's probably at this point past childbearing age. She's about 10 years younger than Abram, we find out in a latter chapter. And keep in mind, Abram lives to be 175, so childbearing age for women probably extended beyond what it typically does today because they were living longer, but she's still getting up there in age, right? And she's been trying, but she can't conceive. So she was tempted to not trust the Lord, and Abram and her end up following through with this plan that really shows that they aren't trusting what God's told them. They kind of come up with this roundabout way of fathering an heir through one of Sarai's servants. Another mistake that we see here is that Abram is not the patriarch that he needs to be. He's not the leader of his household, the faith leader that he needs to be. We saw him being a great patriarch in chapter 14, and we talked about that in our application section. But here, he should have said to his wife, we're not going to do this, we're going to trust the Lord, and we're going to do things his way. Instead, he gives in to his wife, and he goes about this backwards plan. Well, as you might have guessed, or maybe you already know, this plan does not go very well, very smoothly, and it certainly does not accomplish what it was intended to accomplish. And that's generally what happens to plans that are made in an absence of faith. Hagar successfully conceives a child, and when she realizes that she's conceived, her attitude changes. It says that she starts to look down on, she starts to look with contempt on Sarai. Maybe that she's better than her because she's going to provide an heir to Abram's household, and Sarai isn't able to do anything. Right? So she's got kind of a chip on her shoulder walking around seemingly, and this really makes Sarai mad. We're told that Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar to the point that Hagar ends up running away. She runs away from Abram's house and she flees south into the wilderness. That brings us to section number 2, verses 7 through 16. The angel of the Lord makes Hagar a promise. So we're told that the title given here is the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord finds Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness and asks her, where are you coming from and where are you going? So a couple things to point out here. First is this name of the angel of the Lord. When we think about an angel, most of the time we think about just a servant of God, like a spiritual being. Angel means messenger. So a messenger of God, a spiritual being who's coming to do God's work on earth. But in the Old Testament, and you'll know this if you went through our 5-minute Bible studies with us, in the Old Testament, we often see this one that is referred to as the angel of the Lord. And what we see at the end of this chapter and also several other places in the Old Testament is that this angel, this messenger of the Lord, is actually the Lord himself. Many believe that it's Jesus before he became a man and lived on earth. So we're not just talking about any old angel here, but rather we're talking about deity. This is a messenger of the Lord. This is the Lord himself bringing a message. And before he gets to the message that he's bringing, he asks Hagar a question. Where are you coming from and where are you going? What are you running from and where do you intend to go? She told him that she was fleeing from her mistress, Sarai. And as far as where she intended to go, we don't exactly know. Maybe she didn't have any plan at all. But the angel of the Lord told Hagar to return to Sarai. He says, go back. He told her that she was pregnant. She already knew that, but that she was pregnant with a son, and that the Lord was going to make her child's descendants into a large nation. Hagar was instructed to name her son Ishmael. So this is quite a significant promise, and a huge nation of people, the Arab people, grow out of Ishmael's line. But she receives a promise that's similar to the one that's been given to Abraham, that her not similar in every way, but at least in terms of that a great nation is going to grow out of this child that's in her womb. Abram's got a promise that the child that he will eventually have with his wife when he does things God's way will also be a great nation. What's interesting is that if you look down through history, the Jewish people come from Abram's line, the Arab people come from Ishmael's line, and if you know anything about relationships between those two, it's strained to say the least, and there's been a lot of war, a lot of violence, a lot of hatred between those two groups over the years. But these nations grow out of these individuals. Ishmael comes from Hagar. The Jews will eventually come from Sarai, but Abram is the father of both nations. The angel of the Lord prophesied something interesting about Ishmael, and that was that he would be a, quote, wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. So he's going to be surrounded by conflict, and I think certainly in that part of the world, that prophecy has come true. Hagar then blesses the Lord and calls him this name, which is translated for us, the God of seeing, because he looked at her, he saw her when she was by herself in the wilderness, all alone. So maybe she thought that God had forgotten about her, or that she was too insignificant for Abram's God to even care about. Yet Abram's God comes to her at this well and shows her that he does care and that he does see her. The spring of water where the angel of the Lord met her becomes known by the name of Beer Lahairoi. And we're told at the end of the chapter that Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael is born. Hagar listens to the instructions of the angel of the Lord. She returns to Abram's house. She submits herself to Sarai. And evidently she tells Abram what happened to her at this well, because what we see is that Abram follows through with the angel of the Lord's instructions, and he does, in fact, name her son Ishmael. So that is Genesis chapter 16. We are going to see Hagar again. We're going to see Ishmael again. And they are, again, going to be at the center of a significant controversy in Abram's house. And again, a lot of that is because of the mistakes that are made here in faithlessness. Instead of being patient and waiting on God, Sarai, Abram take things into their own hands. They try this terrible plan, and it's going to wreak havoc on their house for years to come. So let's talk about that a little bit more as we finish up today with our application. And I think we've touched on this application already, but I think it's worth repeating. You can't rush God's plan. In Genesis chapter 12, God made Abram this promise that he was going to make him a great nation. In chapter 15, he said that he was going to give him a biological son. But as Sarai and Abram get older and the chances of conceiving a child naturally were decreasing, rather than trusting God's promise, Sarai decides to take matters into her own hands. In the upcoming chapters, we're going to see the consequences play out of this mistake of faithlessness. So here's the application that we need to think about. It's always better to trust God patiently than to take matters into our own hands in an attempt to solve things more quickly. A lot of times when we try to solve things on our own, we end up getting ourselves in trouble, and then we end up with only bad options. I think that's kind of what we see in Abram here when he gives in to his wife. He says, okay, I'll go into Hagar and we'll try to conceive that way. Right? And then the whole thing blows up in his face. Sarai is mad at Hagar. And then what happens? His first bad decision leads to a group of choices that are just as equally bad. His choices are, number one, he can allow Hagar to remain in his household even though she's got this bad attitude towards his wife. And then, there's going to be all kinds of issues growing out of that, no doubt, if she remains in the household acting all puffed up in Sarai's face. That's not a good option. His other option is to do what he did. He tells Sarai, he's like, well, she's your servant. Do whatever you want with her. So he's just he fathered a child with this woman, and now he's like, well, if you want to chuck her out of the house, or treat her horribly, then fine, do it. If they had just trusted God's timing and trusted God's plan and not taken things into their own hands, they never would have had to get to that point. And so although it's hard to be patient, the reality is the more things we try to do without God's guidance and his help, very well could be that we're just digging ourselves deeper and deeper into a hole that's going to be really difficult to get out of. It's always better to trust God patiently than to take matters into our own hands and attempt to solve them more quickly. So that is our study for today in Genesis chapter 16. Thank you, everybody, for joining. If you haven't already rated the podcast, you can do that in some podcast apps. That would be really appreciated. Some people have asked how to do that on the YouTube channel. You can't do that on the YouTube channel. You can leave a like and a comment. That's always great, and it helps us. But you can't do it on the YouTube channel. There's just certain podcast apps that allow it. I know Apple Podcasts and Spotify, they both have the star rating system. So if you're on one of those, I'd really love it if you would leave a review. I would really appreciate it. Thanks for studying with us today. Lord willing, we'll be back again tomorrow, talk about Genesis 17.